Our continuing journey is now going to take us to the northern portion of Arizona, the land of canyons and mesas. And our speaker, Andrea Hazelton, has already noted in her abstract for her talk that this is a really complex landscape. It's got lots of landscape heterogeneity. It's got a combination of bedrock geology. I think she'll probably tell us more about that. And a landscape like this is especially interesting botanically because it means that plant populations often have little populations in small areas, and they may become adapted to their particular local microhabitat, but that is a real engine for speciation. I think Wendy talked a lot about, species that she thinks are new species or places where they found variant populations in this landscape. And I think that this is probably something that Andrea is going to touch on as well. So Andrea is with us from Northern Arizona. She works for the Spring Stewardship Institute, which is an NGO that focuses on protecting fragile spring ecosystems. And we learned a little bit about the riparian in the western part of Arizona. So apparently the northern part of Arizona shares that same quality. She studied at the Arizona State University. Her graduate degree was in riparian ecology, so she's well trained for working on spring systems. And after she graduated, she worked in endangered species management for a little while with the Navajo Nation. She also spent some time at Sevillita National Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico working on a flora project. And so she's here with us tonight, and she's going to talk about the sacred and the beautiful.
Thanks everybody for being here tonight. Tonight I'm going to take you on a brief journey through Northern Arizona and talk about just a few of the plants and places that are important to me. So here I am in the SSI lab, 8 o'clock at night, alone at work. You've got a great view of the fume hood behind my head, but I'm doing my best to picture all of my old friends in this audience, because I know you guys are out there and I miss you and I wish we were hanging out right now. And for all of you that I haven't met, it's really nice to meet you. I hope we get to meet in person someday. And this is me on the slide, working various places in Northern Arizona. And so before I get into talking about plants, I'm going to go lightly philosophy of science on you. And I just want to briefly talk about my use of the word sacred in the title to this talk, which is a little bit bold for a scientist giving a talk at a professional conference. But for me, it's a word that is really strongly connected to this region. And it goes back to the experience that I had when I first moved here. So I grew up in West Phoenix, and then I lived in Tempe for 8 years while I went to ASU. And right after that, I moved to a very small community outside of Tuba City on the Navajo Nation. And I lived in this house in the upper photo, which is made out of sandstone blocks, which had been cut out of the cliff that was about 100 yards away. We did not have electricity. We did have running water, which was piped directly from a spring that came out of that same cliff. And I may as well have moved to the moon. It was so different from the place that I came from. And in my new home, I was suddenly surrounded by people who were from a culture that was very different from mine. I made friends with my neighbors who are Navajo, and I made some friends who I met in Tuba City who were Hopi and farmed in the Moenkopi Wash floodplain. And then I started my job with the Navajo tribe, and I was the only white woman at work. And as all of this happened, I was suddenly bombarded by the word sacred. I was immersed in this crazy, stunning, barren landscape and surrounded by people who were like nobody I'd ever met before. And they were all telling me that every place around us, every plant and every animal was sacred. I was told that I needed to say a particular prayer before I could collect a plant. And at the time, I was hearing a lot about what was at the time a proposed snowmaking up on Snowball, which the tribe said was going to defile a sacred place. And I got to tell you, I didn't know how to process all of this. And I just didn't know. It was all very new to me. And I didn't know if I really could have a full understanding of that word without a belief in the supernatural, which I don't personally have. But I did feel as though my neighbors and my coworkers might be onto something, because it was their land, first of all, but also I was feeling something about the place. And if I had to choose a word, I would have chosen the word awe personally. But it's been a decade now, and I've had a while to think about this, and I've gotten more comfortable with the concept. And the thing is, if you look up the word sacred in the dictionary, you do get some definitions that are very explicitly religious. But then there are other definitions which are more general and centered very much around this concept of value, of great value, something that is worthy of us applying great value to it. And who can argue with that, right? But again, as a scientist, I have this habit of like asking the next question, which for me was, okay, so how exactly do we decide what is important or valuable enough to be considered sacred? And it turns out that that falls into the realm of this thing, which is an even more terrifying word called spirituality. But if you look it up, it basically just means the search for meaning in life. Okay, we all do that, I hope. And that can include an assessment of our relationship with ourselves, with others, and with the natural world. See, I've tied it back. We're going to talk about plants, I promise. And the thing is, it got me thinking a little bit more, and this is about plants, I promise. As somebody who works in plant conservation, about the importance not only of remembering to ask the right scientific questions, like what is the probability of this rare plant going extinct? But also we need to remember that the other half of that question, whether or not we should do something about it, and if so, how much are we willing to sacrifice? How far should we go to save that plant? Is actually not science. It falls into this category that we don't like to think about being explicit as spirituality. But these two separate things are both very important. We need to not conflate them, and we do need both of them. Okay, moving on. I'm going to talk about plants of northern Arizona. So tonight I'm going to take you to a few places in northern Arizona that cause me to feel awe. And at each of these places, I'm going to tell you about one plant that lives there that is valued by humans for one reason or another. Okay, this is a picture of northern Arizona, and I had a lot of fun putting labels on some of the more visible landmarks. The dark colors are either forest or volcanic, or both in some cases. And there's a lot going on geologically, like Lynn alluded to. Over on the west side, that's Mojave Desert. And thank you so much, Val and Karen, for covering that, because I'm actually going to neglect it. It's basin and range. We've been hearing a lot about basin and range. So in the center, the dark areas are the San Francisco volcanic field. And fun fact, it's a very young volcanic field. I believe the most recent eruption is only about 800 years old. So that's pretty cool. And then over on the east side, that fun pink area is the Colorado Plateau. And the Colorado Plateau is a layer cake of sedimentary rocks that was laid down when the dinosaurs roamed the earth and earlier, as shallow seas receded, and it came and went across the landscape. And then the landscape was uplifted in the same mountain building event that caused the Rocky Mountains, that formed the Rocky Mountains. And then, of course, cutting across all of it is the Grand Canyon, which I don't know if you can see my mouse very well, but here is Lake Powell. And then downstream of that is the Grand Canyon running all the way across. And then Lake Mead is over here to the west. So, and the stops on our tour are marked with hearts. Okay, first stop. All right, Flagstaff. Why in the world would she choose Flagstaff? So picture yourself, you live in Arizona. It's August, it's 113 degrees. You've been air conditioning hopping for weeks. You haven't been outside. And finally you take the afternoon, Friday afternoon off work, and you get in your car and you sit in traffic on I-17 because everybody else is doing the same thing at the same time as you. And it takes like 4.5 hours. And finally you get up north to Flagstaff. And as you're rolling off the freeway, you roll down your window and you fill your lungs with cold air that smells like pine and vanilla. And you look over next to the highway, there's a field full of wildflowers. And those wildflowers are Rocky Mountain bee plants and annual sunflowers. And that is why I love this plant. Okay, Rocky Mountain bee plant. Paratoma cerulata is the current name, but many of us learned it as Cleome cerulata. I'm not going to try to say the Navajo name because one thing has been made very clear to me: I'm not able to pronounce them properly. It's part of the Cleomaceae, which was split out of, many of us learn this plant as being part of the caper family, but genetic evidence shows that it's actually more closely related to mustards. And so 10 genera were split out into Cleomaceae. Ecologically, this plant is a weed. It's an annual and it likes to live in fields on the roadside and places that are disturbed and have a little bit more moisture. And, you know, you've heard a lot about rare plants at this meeting, and many of us, including myself, put a lot of value on rarity. But this plant has over the centuries probably, or longer, been actually valued for its abundance and availability. It is edible. And I have heard it referred to as the fourth sister, with the three sisters being those traditional Native American agricultural crops of corn, beans, and squash. So I've also heard other plants referred to as the fourth sister, so don't get overly excited about this. But I do have one resource which says that this plant specifically saved the Navajo from starvation over and over again. So that's significant. I guess it's best harvested when it's about 4 inches tall, and it smells real funky. So I was actually surprised to find out it's edible, but apparently what you have to do is boil it for a long time. And then you drain off the water and boil it in fresh water, and then drain that and boil it a third time in fresh water. And then you can put it in your stew, or you can dry it for winter so that you have greens in the winter. So that's pretty neat. Moving on to our next sacred place is the San Francisco Peaks. And I've already mentioned this place being sacred. My understanding is every tribe in the region considers this mountain a sacred mountain. I know the most about the Navajo and Hopi tradition. So the Navajo consider it their sacred mountain to the west. They have 4 sacred mountains that mark the boundaries of their traditional area. And then the Hopi, to them, that mountain also marks one of their boundaries, but they also call it the cloud house, where their ancestral Kachina spirits live for half the year. So that's pretty substantial. And then of course, for myself as a Flagstaff resident, this mountain is very important to me. I look at it every single day. Sometimes I can't see it when there's a storm. And when I want to experience great beauty, I go and visit it. It's also really handy for navigation. I always know which way north is. So the plant that I've chosen to represent San Francisco Peaks is the San Francisco Peaks groundsel. It is sacred for its rarity. It is protected by the Endangered Species Act, and it only lives above timberline in the San Francisco Peaks. It's part of the sunflower family, and it lives in volcanic talus, which is a pretty unstable landscape. And so ecologically, this plant is adapted to its habitat. It has rhizomes that help stabilize it in the soil as the land moves out from underneath it. So that's pretty cool. And in order to protect this plant, the Forest Service has prohibited camping and off-trail hiking over the elevation of 11,400 feet. Okay, next destination is Grand Canyon. You may not do a tour of Northern Arizona without going to the Grand Canyon. It is obligatory. So Grand Canyon, I know a lot of people who consider the Grand Canyon their very special sacred place. I personally, that's not my thing quite as much. I find it to be too big and too rugged and too harsh to take in. But for me, I am able to enjoy the Grand Canyon more when I think about it from the perspective of people who might have lived there sometime in the past and thrived and grown food and made it their home. And there's actually a really good passage about this in River and Desert Plants of Grand Canyon, which is a really great book. And so it goes, the plant communities we see today in Grand Canyon are the result of generations of co-evolution between people and their environment. It has only been within our recent history that these lands have been viewed as a wilderness, a place where the forces of nature prevail and the human imprint is relatively unnoticeable. So when hiking up a side canyon, perhaps we can picture ourselves 3,000 years earlier. Rather than seeing the shadow cast by an agave stalk on sun-dried Indian rice grass as a photographic opportunity, we might see our farming activities culminating in a meal for a family. And that's why I chose agavephilipsiana as the plant to represent Grand Canyon. And this, I'm pretty sure Wendy talked about this plant last night, but the common name is Grand Canyon century plant. And it's very important to note that while this is Grand Canyon century plant, it's actually only found a few places, but all the places it's found are in Grand Canyon. But in contrast, there are tons of other century plants in Grand Canyon, the Utah century plant. There's 2 different varieties of agave utahensis that are just all over the place in there. So what makes agavephilipsiana special? It is larger than the natives, it's rare, and it's associated with archaeological sites. Because the thing is, agaves are incredibly useful plants. The leaves are full of these super strong fibers and they are tipped with needles. How handy is that? Your needle is already threaded. They have these tall, strong flowering stalks that you can use to make tools and building things and stuff. And then you can also eat the hearts. So the place where all the leaves come together and meet the ground, if you dig it up, you can roast it and it tastes like molasses. It's really good. And so, so the thing about agavephilipsiana is it is larger than the Utah agave and pretty much like the leaves are longer, it's taller. So you get more of all these things. And the closest genetic relative to this plant is in Mexico. So Wendy put this story together that the idea is that the early residents of the Grand Canyon would have used trade routes and obtained this plant from Mexico and planted it in Grand Canyon so that they could use it. So that's really cool. Okay, our next destination is the mesas. And so the mesas refer to a very large area in northeastern Arizona and northwestern New Mexico. It's much of the Colorado Plateau that I pointed out on the map. These uplifted sedimentary rocks, and they're wooded. And this is kind of one of those instances that I actually found really a little bit difficult to comprehend when I first came to Navajo, because they said everything was sacred. And I said, well, how can everything be sacred? But then I thought about, well, okay, life is sacred and life is really common. So here we are with the mesas. They're very common, but they're also really wonderful. And the plant that I chose to represent the mesas is pinyon pine, which is also a very common plant, but also really wonderful. So pinyon pine. I'm trying to advance. There we go. Pinus edgeless. Again, I'm not going to pronounce the Navajo. It's a small to medium-sized tree, and it co-dominates many of the mesas of northeastern Arizona with juniper. And there's this unfortunate thing that's happening with climate change where our pinyon juniper woodlands are becoming juniper woodlands because the pinyons are dying out in a lot of places. I've definitely seen this happening. I've seen acres of dead pinyon in New Mexico, and it's really sad. I haven't personally seen this happen on Navajo yet. And the cool thing about Navajo is you do find these really pinyon dense forests, big, tall pinyons. It's great camping habitat, so pinyon pines are economically important and culturally important. The seeds are delicious, most of us know. And they're also they're important economically. Right now, it is pinyon collecting season. I've been seeing people out in the forest collecting pine nuts, and pretty soon we'll start seeing roadside stands of people selling pine nuts, which in this region where there's not a lot of jobs, any extra source of income is really great. The other thing is I have been told that this plant is used in basically every Navajo ceremony. And I'm sorry, I don't know as much about other tribes. That's just what I happen to know. But it is undoubtedly very culturally important as well as ecologically important plant. So finally, I have saved the best for last, at least for me. Sand dunes. I get really excited about sand dunes. So a whole lot of northeastern Arizona is covered in pink sand, and this is mostly sand that has eroded off the Navajo sandstone, which is just this big pink rock layer. But the thing, Navajo sandstone was actually originally formed out of sand dunes that were all smashed together. So it just comes full circle. The sand became rock, and then now it's become sand again. So this picture that I'm showing you right now is how you find a lot of northern Arizona, which is these sort of stabilized or semi-stabilized dunes. And that just basically means that there's enough vegetation to hold them in place. So even though you still don't want to be there in a windstorm, you're going to get an eye full of sand. It's the whole landscape isn't changing shape rapidly. The land is holding its shape a lot better because the vegetation is holding it in place. But what is really fun are active dunes. That's my friend John Neisted helping me look for Welsh's milkweed up near Tuba City. And so you can't even tell from this photo how big these things are. They're huge. And it's just giant piles of sand that are being moved around by the wind pretty actively.
I have to let you know you have a few minutes left, so you need to.
Oh, wow. Thank you. All right, this is my last plant. Okay, Welsh's milkweed. It's so cool. It is federally threatened. It lives only on large active sand dunes and near the Utah-Arizona border. And it is ecologically adapted for its landscape, similar to the San Francisco Peaks ground cell. It has rhizomes. And for a similar reason, because this landscape is going to move out underneath it really fast, or the plants can get completely buried. And so by having a lot of these plants connected by really long rhizomes, which you can see in the lower right picture, that's my friend Brian Elliott holding onto one. So when the plant gets buried, it can shoot up another sprout wherever is appropriate. Or if the land blows out from underneath it, it's still surviving because it's connected to the ground somewhere. Okay, that's my last plant. This is my last slide. And I just want to say an enormous, enormous thank you to all of you who take the time to take wonderful photos of plants and then put them on SignNet. I wish I had the time to do that. I mean, I know I could. I aspire to be as wonderful as you, and your contributions are helping so many people, especially myself. I could not have put together this talk without you. All right, thank you, I'm done. Thank you, Lynn.
That's great. Thank you so much, Andrea. What a lovely way to look at the landscape of northern Arizona. And we have some comments to that effect in the question and answers. We also have a couple of real questions. So one of them is about the ground cell. What is the lower elevational range of the ground cell?
Oh gosh. You know, I actually wish I knew more hard and fast facts about this plant. I basically only know what I put in the talk. So I just know that it grows above timberline. And I also know that that cutoff that the Forest Service gave is 11,400 feet. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the cutoff for the plant. So I apologize for not knowing the answer.
And we had another question about the pinyon pine. What is the main reason for its decline?
I think it's climate change. And then I've also heard that bark beetle is a part of that as well.
Yeah, and we weren't sure other questions exactly what the state of the bark beetle is in the pine forest, but is it reproducing regularly, or is it sense from your observations? You said you've seen lots of dead ones.
Yeah, I really regret not looking more deeply into this before the talk. I don't want to misspeak because I know somebody in the audience knows the answer to this question and I don't.
Well, Wendy answered your comments about agavephilipsiana. So I'll just tell you that she says their most recent work suggests that instead of an origin in Mexico, it may have originated in southern Arizona, but was still traded extensively northward. So that would explain its representation in the northern part of the state. But she thanked you for including it.
Sure. And that's still a really long way away if you don't have a car, or even if you do.
So yeah, I'm sure. So, and so that's really, those are the questions that I have on here, and we're out of time. We need to move on to our last speaker, but thank you so much for your presentation. And we really appreciate your sharing your view of Northern Arizona with us.